What if you learned that the Bible didn't just reshape the world, but also erased other gods from history? Have you ever paused to ask why African deities are rarely mentioned today? Where did the Orishas go? The ancestral spirits, the divine beings worshipped for centuries across the heart of Africa. Did they vanish on their own, or were they deliberately silenced? As the Bible spread globally, especially during colonization, it didn't just introduce a new faith. It imposed a new spiritual order, one often built on cultural erasure, the demonization of ancient traditions, and the quiet suffocation of old gods. What became of Africa's gods when the Bible arrived? Why were their stories wiped from collective memory? And why does almost no one speak of this today? In this video, we'll explore one of spirituality's most powerful, controversial, and overlooked subjects: the disappearance of African deities amid the rise of biblical Christianity. What you discover may transform not only your view of the Bible, but everything you've ever been taught about faith, spirituality, identity, and ancestry. You'll see how the dominance of the written word, through the Bible, played a decisive role in forming a new spiritual authority, pushing aside thousands of stories once passed down orally with deep faith, reverence, and sacred connection. We'll examine the impact of missionaries, the role of slavery, the systematic erasure of black cultures, and how the God of the Bible, declared the one true God, reshaped the world's spiritual landscape. But be warned, what you're about to hear isn't taught in churches. Many religious leaders avoid this topic at all costs because it involves power, control, religion, and buried history. This isn't an attack on any faith. It's an invitation to question, to open your eyes, to consider that perhaps humanity's spiritual history was written by those who held the paper, the ink, and the sword. So stay until the end, because what I'll share may unravel centuries of silence and rekindle a spiritual flame long suppressed by the colonization of the soul. Are you ready to learn why African gods faded when the Bible entered the scene? Before we dive into this profound mystery, I want to extend a quick invitation. This content goes beyond curiosity. It touches historical wounds, challenges spiritual structures, and reclaims what was ripped away from many: their spiritual identity. If this topic resonates, if you sense a hidden truth here, comment below. Have you ever reflected on this before? Or better yet, do you believe African gods were silenced by history? Your voice matters, and it might awaken others too. If you value conversations that dare to address what others avoid, leave a like. This helps YouTube understand these themes need to reach more people. And of course, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because here we'll keep uncovering the hidden layers of spirituality, the Bible, and the stories only told from one perspective. Now, let's uncover what truly happened when the Bible met the gods of Africa. The untold story begins long before the Bible's arrival. Before the name of Christ crossed oceans, before the first cross was planted on African soil, the continent already pulsed with deep spirituality. Africa has always been profoundly connected to the divine. Ancient civilizations, Yoruba, Bantu, Ashanti, Egyptian, Ethiopian, already possessed rich worldviews, organized spiritual practices, priests, rituals, and temples. And crucially, they had their own gods. These gods weren't mere legends or campfire tales. They were living presences in the collective imagination and spiritual experience of millions. They were forces of nature, guardians of ancestry, messengers between the visible and invisible. They had names, symbols, and power. Orishas like Shango, Ashosi, Yemaya, Obatala, Ogun, among many others, weren't just spirits. They represented cosmic principles, spiritual forces, and universal archetypes. They guided decisions, protected communities, and gave meaning to life and death. This is where the untold part begins. These gods didn't fade from irrelevance. They were erased, silenced, buried beneath a new spiritual structure imposed with force, violence, and promises. That structure had a name: Christianity, specifically biblical Christianity. To understand this replacement, we must recognize a seldom discussed reality: the power of the written word versus the power of orality. African traditions were fundamentally oral. This didn't make them inferior or disorganized. Quite the opposite. Orality was, and remains, a richly layered form of transmitting knowledge. Each story passed through generations carried wisdom, laws, philosophy, spirituality, and identity. This knowledge lived not in books, but in griots, elders, conversation circles, ceremonies, and myths enacted through ritual. It was living wisdom. Judaism and Christianity arrived in Africa armed with sacred texts, written, canonized, standardized. The Bible, with its powerful language and claims of absolute truth, came as an authority, not only spiritual, but cultural, political, and ideological. Imagine the impact. While one people explained creation through oral tales of an ancestral goddess, others arrived with a book stating, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." This God had a name, rules, commandments, and claimed to be the only true God. All others were false. Now consider, when two spiritual systems collide, one oral, one written, which will the world consider official? Which will be recorded in history? Which will become the accepted religion? And which will be labeled witchcraft, paganism, or idolatry? This is how a spiritual network spanning tribes, kingdoms, and empires was discredited, not for lacking power, but for not being written in the way the West demanded. Colonization wasn't just territorial, it was spiritual, and it arrived with a cross, a sword, and a Bible. Every village encountering Christian missionaries faced the idea that their gods were false, their ancestors mistaken, and that a new, the only true, path must be followed. This was imposed, often through manipulation, fear, and bloodshed. But this wasn't merely religious. Something larger was at stake: control of the narrative. And narrative is power. The Bible, as history's most widely distributed, translated, and taught book, didn't just offer a new God. It redefined what the world would see as legitimate spirituality. It dictated what was right to believe and what was wrong. In the process, countless African deities were erased from popular memory as if they never existed. Imagine your entire spiritual heritage, all your ancestors believed, felt, and revered, reduced to superstition or dark magic. Not because it was false, but because the world chose to acknowledge only what was printed. Yet the African gods resisted. They hid in festivals, disguised rituals, syncretism. When people prayed to St. George, they often honored Ogun. When bringing flowers to Our Lady, they honored Yemaya. The faith didn't die, it camouflaged itself. The arrival of Christianity in Africa came in waves. Early influences after Christ, stronger presence in the Middle Ages, and brutal intensity during European colonization and the slave trade. Missionaries, backed by European empires, came with a conversion mission, which meant destroying what existed before. Temples were torn down, sacred objects burned, people rebaptized with Christian names. Each baptism denied ancestry. Each planted cross symbolized a new faith, replacing all others. This wasn't merely religious change. It was a restructuring of the soul, a spiritual amputation whose echoes are still felt today. That's why revisiting these stories is vital. When we grasp what happened then, we start to question what we experience now. We begin to understand why so many feel disconnected, empty, without spiritual grounding. Perhaps what's missing isn't faith, but memory. Don't leave yet, because what follows reveals how this was intentional, planned, systematic. You'll see how African gods were replaced, how collective imagination was reshaped, and why these stories remain suppressed. If this makes you reflect, comment below. I am reclaiming my spiritual memory. Or simply, the gods were silenced, not gone right from the heart. Let's show the algorithm and community this topic needs discussion. Now, one of history's great spiritual shifts, the power of written narrative. It may seem obvious now, but when we speak of ancestral spirituality, especially African spirituality, the mode of transmission changed everything. The oldest, most vibrant way of passing knowledge has always been oral. African gods, orishas, sacred ancestors, the myths shaping civilizations weren't trapped on pages. They lived in voices, bodies, rhythms, songs, rituals, in the eyes of elders telling sacred stories by firelight. The sacred was born in the vibration of the spoken word, in sound carrying memory. But this oral wisdom had an invisible enemy, the power of the written word. The Bible, unlike African tradition, was a book with authority, a beginning, middle, and end. A book declaring itself the only truth, the supreme revelation, the Creator's manual. This book carried not just spiritual messages, but hegemony. When you fix a story in writing, you standardize it. You limit interpretation. You turn sacred narrative into doctrine. This isn't a critique of the Bible. It's a historical observation. What's on paper is harder to question. If it's written, it's official, recorded, indisputable. That's what happened. African stories, passed orally, were seen as legends, local myths, baseless beliefs. Biblical stories recorded in an ancient book, translated, printed, distributed, were seen as ultimate truth, legitimate history. The written word became a tool of spiritual validation. African spirituality was erased not because it was weak, but because it wasn't documented the Western way. It was treated as inferior for not following the logic of print. It had no printed genesis, but it had memory of how the world emerged from the union of elements and dance of deities. It had no written gospels, but it had songs, prayers, chants spanning generations, linking people to the orishas. It had no apostolic epistles, but it had dreams, visions, spiritual appearances, ancestral revelations. None on paper. Cultural domination understood this well. Colonizers and missionaries used the Bible as a standard. Anything not aligning with that model was heresy, deception, idolatry, witchcraft. Anything not in the Bible was an enemy of God. African gods were called demons. Rituals labeled witchcraft. Respected priests were persecuted. All based on a book claiming only one true God, all others false. Again, this isn't against the book itself, but against its use as a tool of cultural erasure. Written narratives began shaping not only faith, but thought, worldview, spiritual reality. Imagine growing up believing the God of your land, the Orisha guiding your ancestors, is evil simply because it's not in the Bible. Imagine fearing what was part of your roots, essence, identity. This is more than religious oppression. It's colonization of the soul. And it wasn't just the Bible. Official documents, colonial records, history books told one version, the victors. In that version, African gods had no place. They were erased, as if Africa was a faithless continent awaiting Christian enlightenment. But that's a lie, a profound lie. Africans already had spirituality, philosophy, moral codes, rites of passage, healing systems, ancestral wisdom. The difference, it wasn't printed on paper. It lived in bodies, dance, gaze, drum beats, scent of herbs, silence of sacred forests. The written word became a symbol of progress and civilization, and with it, judgment. If your faith wasn't written, it wasn't valid. If your God had no chapter, it wasn't true. If your ritual had no Latin translation, it was pagan. But does spirituality need paper to be legitimate? Can the divine only be accessed through letters? Has what isn't written ceased to exist? These questions hurt because they force us to confront a system that trained us to believe only what comes from outside is true. That taught us to despise our roots. That made millions ashamed of their beliefs, afraid of their practices, even disgusted by their ancestry. That's why reflecting on the power of written narrative matters. Not to deny the Bible, but to understand how it's been used for cultural and spiritual domination. Because when you control the narrative, you control the mind. And when you control the mind, you erase memory. The lingering question, did African gods disappear, or were they silenced by a system that decided only one narrative deserved remembrance? If you felt this weight, comment, words can be weapons. or what is unwritten is also sacred. These aren't just phrases, they're resistance, living memory, part of a spiritual struggle continuing today. Now, a deeper revelation: how this spiritual replacement was structured. The erasure of African gods wasn't cultural coincidence or religious side effect. It was planned, executed, sustained for centuries. It had a name: colonization, and its key ally, Christianity. European missionaries arrived with a project of domination, a complete restructuring of African identity. The Christian faith, though rooted in love, forgiveness, salvation, became a symbolic and ideological weapon justifying what followed: slavery, land theft, cultural destruction, custom imposition, and above all, replacing local deities with one divine figure, the Christian God. Imagine a village that for generations revered its orishas, made offerings to ancestors, consulted priests, followed a spiritual cycle tied to nature and community. Then imagine invaders in strange clothes, speaking foreign tongues, carrying crosses, saying, "Your God doesn't exist. Only ours is true. Convert or burn in hell." Understand the spiritual violence. These missionaries brought the idea that anything unbiblical was primitive, inferior, dangerous. African gods were labeled. What was divine became demonic. What was sacred became superstition. Honoring ancestors became worshiping the dead. Everything was distorted in the name of civilization. The Bible became a seal of approval for brutal erasure. European empires knew domination by force worked, but domination by faith was more effective. Destroy the body, people resist. Dominate the spirit, people obey. Christianity, meant as a message of light, was hijacked for imperial purposes. Missionaries entered first before armies. They planted the cross, presented Jesus as Savior. Then came traders, soldiers, explorers. Minds were already molded, spirits weakened. The original sacred replaced by a God who didn't speak their language, understand their dances, accept their rights. This isn't to say the God of the Bible is the villain. The issue is how this God was presented, a God who said, "I alone am true," who condemned all others, who brooked no competition. Those maintaining ancestral faith were punished, excluded, judged, often killed. Demonizing African gods was strategic. Erasing these spiritual symbols destroyed the foundation of African culture. Because without faith, without spiritual identity, people are easier to manipulate. Drums were banned, tereros destroyed, sacred objects burned, spiritual leaders arrested, tortured, all while the Bible was read, prayers for salvation recited. A crucial detail: the direct link between Bible, empire, and civilization. Europeans viewed Africans as savages. The Bible proved salvation came only through conversion. African spirituality wasn't just ignored, it was treated as God's enemy. This legitimized any violence, from cultural destruction to human trafficking. Ancestral spirituality was fought as a threat because it was a threat to the colonial system. The orishas were too powerful, rituals too strong, connection to ancestors too deep. This had to be broken. What existed had to be replaced with something obeying new rules. Rules from Europe, rules in writing, rules in the Bible. So African gods were erased from physical world and collective memory. New generations grew up not knowing their gods' names. They were taught there was only one, all others evil. Over time, they believed it. That's the deepest wound. When people reject their own spiritual roots, domination is complete. But the system didn't expect. These gods didn't die. They hid, disguised in syncretism, blended with Catholic saints, encoded in festivals, kept in the bodies of maize and pious de santo, in hands that still prepare herbal baths, in feet that still dance for the orishas, even if the names are forgotten. They survived, and they're awakening. All this was done in God's name. But what God demands others be destroyed to be recognized? What faith is only valid denying all before it? What spirituality imposes itself with guns, ships, whips? These questions are uncomfortable but necessary. to understand how the Bible, despite sacred content, was used as a colonization tool, not just of lands, but of souls. Now that eyes are opening, we must speak, recover what was lost, remember forgotten names, resurrect spiritual memories buried under centuries of imposition and silence. If this resonates, comment, ancestral faith endures. Or, they tried to erase it, but couldn't. Make it personal. Write the name of an Orisha or African deity you respect or wish to know. Let's transform comments into a space of spiritual reconnection. Now, how African gods stayed alive in silence, and how people secretly protected them within the imposed religious system. Even facing colonization's brutality, the Bible's imposition, the demonization of African gods, people didn't fully surrender. Within the African soul lies unbreakable spiritual resistance. One brilliant survival form, syncretism. Syncretism, often seen as mere belief blending, was one of humanity's great spiritual survival strategies. Imagine, you're torn from your land, taken to another continent, forbidden your language, punished for your songs, threatened with death for your rituals. But you still feel your Orisha calling. You feel Ogun's protection, Ayanse's strength, Nana's lullaby. Yet you're forced to pray to Catholic saints. What do? You see in the saint a reflection of your ancestral god. Ogun dressed as Saint George, Yamaya hidden behind Our Lady, Shango revealed in Saint Jerome or John the Baptist, Oxum embraced by Our Lady of Candelaria. In imposed masses, Africans kept worshipping their gods, not from rebellion, but necessity. It was that or lose spiritual connection entirely. Syncretism was genius, hiding the sacred within the sacred, using imposed faith to keep original faith alive. This wasn't cultural adaptation, it was pure resistance, camouflaged spirituality.